one of the things that you, I think you've become known for in American cultural anthropology and across the world in the discipline is for advocating for and standing up for the rights of the people with whom you work, professionally, personally, and this has led to various articles. How did that start? When you arrived there, did you, for the first time in '62, think, no, this is the place I could spend more time, this is the place where you developed close relationships quite quickly, or did that come with repeat visits over the years?
It came with repeated visits, and I didn't start out to be an activist. With the Kaipo, I started out to be an objectifying anthropological analyst, ethnographer, theoretician. I was interested in problems of theoretical problems of interpretation of indigenous social structures and myths and rituals and the whole kit and caboodle. Wrote my thesis on social and political organization of the Kayapo, but included a lot of material on ritual, because ritual is a part of social and political organization, especially among the Kayapo. And I became progressively more involved in, well, first, taking the part of the Indians against the Indian service, because they were really being exploited by the Indian service to produce crops like Brazil nuts, and the Indian service was, its agents were selling off their production, in ways that, sort of extra legal ways. So they weren't returning any of the product any of the profits to the Indians. And I even denounced one set of encargados, that is Indian service agents, to the head of the Indian service in Rio, only to find that a few months later, this very head of the Indian service was fired for corruption involving, in part, being in cahoots with the very guys that I had denounced. So that when I went back, I faced a series of fairly exciting incidents with these guys, but they never really became physically threatening, just unpleasant. But there are several things that were going on. From 63, early 64, I got back from my first field work. But when I got back from my field work, especially at during my thesis time, I wrote the thesis rather rapidly, so I didn't ever have a chance to get much involved in the political activities that were steadily growing in those years against the Vietnam War, especially. But when I then came back in 1965, and I then took, as I said, my first job in fall '66. I got more and more involved in anti-war activity. There were still aspects of the black struggle going on. And one of the things that was happening there was that people who were activists were trying to teach themselves Marx and the whole Marxist tradition, because we hadn't learned that in American universities. And so I joined a series of reading groups, and I read and studied Marx in that context
At Cornell.
starting at Cornell, but then going on to Chicago. And it just went along with being a political activist at that time. But since I was at that point, I was an assistant professor. I was a young faculty member. I tried to build all the stuff I was doing in these reading groups into my teaching. I started teaching courses in Marx and Marxian theory, Marxist tradition in various ways, um, uh, with emphasis on the kinds of things we were hitting in these reading groups in the context of activism. But at the same time, I felt like a kind of a double schizophrenic in a sense, intellectually. I mean, I was teaching Marx. We were reading theses on Feuerbach and Capital and all that. And then I was talking about the social production of households and domestic groups and moiety systems and so on in central Brazil. And that was not somehow meeting up with the Marxian stuff. I mean, what do you do with societies that don't really have economies? There's no commodity production, no market, nothing like that. But of course, in Marx and Engels, early Marx and Engels anyway, you've got this rich tradition of human production, global social production, the production of the person, the production of needs, the production of social relations. All that counts as production. Well, the Kaipo were doing that. And in fact, I thought, in a sense, my whole interpretation of them was gravitating towards making social production in that large sense the basis of my whole interpretation of their, what you might call in Marxian terms, ideology and institutional structure and so on. That was schizophrenia number one. That is, I was trying to reconcile the Marxian tradition with the kinds of interpretations I had sort of been working out of the Kaipo. But the second schizophrenia was, of course, that along with Marxian understanding and a Marxian theoretical approach goes a commitment to activism. And the question was, what kind of commitment to activism did my theoretical approach to the Kaipo and other Amazonian society questions that I was working on involve? I mean, what is the basis of activism in a Marxian sense if you lift the whole question out of the context of a class struggle, a class society? Well, I had sort of come to see Kaipo society is built around relations of exploitation. As I mentioned, gender exploitation, exploitation of juniors by seniors, sons-in-law by parents-in-law, all those kinds of things. And that in a Marxian perspective, you should be able to understand exploitation as involving asymmetrical distributions of social value, which means you have to have some kind of theory of value for a society lacking an economy and lacking any category of abstract labor or any of the categories that were fundamental to Marxian theory of value, as taught and certainly understood by us amateur Marxian scholars in these reading groups. So I became more and more involved both in teaching and in political work, political activism, with these questions. And one of the things that they led back to was the question of what kind of activism or commitment to political activity, what kind of political activity did my work with the Kaipo lead to. So there's a political level of the question, but there was also, of course, a human level, because all this time, 68 was the great year of the great scandals of so-called genocide of Amazonian Indians. It was a very overblown use of the term. Genocide is a policy of extermination of a whole ethnic genus of people. The Brazilian government was not committing genocide in the sense that the Nazis committed genocide, but it was not doing its utmost to help the Indians survive either. I mean, it was presiding over a system where, with malign neglect, it was allowing the course of development, a kind of a brutal, ecologically and humanly destructive development, to roll over Indian societies that really had no defense against the process. It was bad what was happening, no question about it. And I thought anybody who would forget Marxian theory, I mean, if you've been there and you know what's happening, you have to speak out against that. But also, I thought it was important for anybody with a theoretical approach to the question and supposedly tools to understand things in a theoretical way, including relations of exploitation and that sort of thing. It was important to make theoretical sense out of it and to build that theoretical sense into what you are doing or going to do about it. And so I got interested, and so I became involved in organizing various kinds of political projects, NGO, non-governmental organization activities, working with Brazilian non-governmental organizations, such as what was then called the Ecumenical Center for Documentation and Interpretation and Information, the Centro Ecumenico de Documentação e Informação, and the Center for Indigenous Work, both based in São Paulo. I worked a lot with those groups and tried to articulate the Kayapo and Kayapo activists and activities with them, and vice versa. And I also tried to address the questions of human rights and indigenous rights, territorial rights, so on, cultural rights, group rights, all those issues at a theoretical level and an institutional level within the American Anthropological Association. Not because, just because that was the association to which I belonged, and I am, after all, an American and teaching in American academic context, so that seemed the place to start. And I became involved in the effort to establish a Committee for Human Rights in the American Anthropological Association. It was quite a struggle. There was a lot of opposition because people thought, number one, there's a lot of feeling that anthropologists are objective scientific scholars, and then value-laden research and commitments to activism have no place in that. Secondly, there was a lot of feeling that taking positions on behalf of indigenous peoples in a country like, say, Brazil, would lead in short order to anthropologists being excluded from working in Brazil, and that anthropologists just were cutting off their nose to spite their face, so to speak, by adopting these positions. And so, I became involved in arguments against that position and became a founding member of the Committee for Human Rights. It started out being the Commission, the Task Force on Human Rights, then the Commission on Human Rights, then finally the Committee for Human Rights. And in the course of that, one of the charges that the association laid down for its Commission and then Committee for Human Rights was to formulate an anthropological position, a general anthropological position about human rights. I mean, after all, if anthropology is the science, if you will, of human being, human existence, then it should have something to say about human rights. I mean, what is it about being human that confers rights? Or if you think you know, you can say something about what it means to be human, you should be able to say something about why having rights is part of that, or flows from that. Various publications followed from that, some in partnership with comrades on the Human Rights Committee, people like Carol Nagengast of the University of New Mexico. We co-authored, we co-edited a issue of the Journal of Anthropological Research, wrote a joint introduction. That's now being published as a book. And, well, there have been other co-publications, but I think this is a series of issues I think are quite theoretically fundamental for the discipline. I mean, it's not that applied anthropology or issues like that, which always were the sort of stepchild of the discipline, and they were partly the stepchild of the discipline because the approach was basically that if you were doing applied stuff, you were teaching people to get out of their whatever their culture had been and become good little marginally utilitarian consumers and producers for a capitalistic enterprise. I thought it was very important to try to help establish a different sort of approach to applied work and activist work. First of all, to bridge the gap between applied and activist anthropology, because applied anthropologists, many of them, resisted classifying themselves as being activists because that seemed political, and they were just being economic or something like that. Anyway, but beyond that, the idea that, well, there was theory on the one hand, and then there was activism or applied work on the other, I thought was fundamentally wrong. That in fact, applied anthropology and, well, what it might be anyway, and human rights and issues of that sort were posed challenges that of a kind that put an entire discipline on its mettle. That the discipline, if it really had anything to say at all, should be able to confront the implicit and I hope increasingly explicit theoretical issues in that sort of line. And I think that's happened to a great degree, but I also think that those are struggles that are going to have to just keep being, to the extent that they're ever won, they're going to have to keep being won, because I think there are very powerful pressures in the other direction, always.
Two questions about this which have occurred to me while you've been talking about it. The first is the involvement and complicity with Brazilian authorities. You mentioned the fact that you went to Indian Affairs and said two of your characters weren't doing as well as they should have been. On the one hand,
that was in 1963, yeah.
On the one hand, you're getting a research visa probably, or permission to work in the area from the administration. On the other hand, you're representing the perspectives and often the needs of the indigenous people with whom you work. Have there been tensions throughout your career about this, or have Brazilian colleagues also understood your activist perspective, or how does one negotiate those conflicting loyalties as well? To the academy, to Brazil, to the indigenous communities?
A lot of questions there. Yeah, there have been a lot of tensions, but there are tensions at every level. There are tensions working with the indigenous community, where some indigenous leaders, in my view, have been busily involved in selling out their own indigenous kin and compatriots, and one struggles at that level sometimes with them. And on the other hand, there are many very good people who work for the Brazilian Indian Service, or at the present, it's called now the National Foundation for the Indian, FUNAI. And I myself have worked for FUNAI, most recently last year, when I did a whole investigation of an area which is a traditional Kayapo area, which has remained undemarcated, and is as it were, the keystone in the arch of Kayapo territories along the east bank of the Xingu River. I prepared for Funai and be acting as a consultant for Funai, a report on the basis for making a claim for demarcation of this area, the ethno-historical basis, the basis in use, the basis in the politics of the area, and the threat to various sorts of agribusinesses encroaching, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, that was a contribution to what I hoped would be a Funai effort to actually get that area demarcated. And, compile a report, a fairly extensive effort, and it was filed. Briefly, it seemed like that was all that was going to happen. I wrote an extra memo when there was an outbreak of shooting, that nobody was hurt, but that was by sheer luck, and that tensions were reaching a really explosive point, and that they had a choice. They either had to do this demarcation and somehow decisively intervene to get these guys who are doing these invading illegal ranchers and so on, to get them out of there, or else they were going to have a situation of low-intensity warfare in the Xingu that was going to be extremely hard to control. And perhaps partly as a result of that memo and the previous report, Funai has now undertaken to form a brief, to produce a legal brief for the demarcation of the area. And I feel very good about the comradeship I have with some of the people who work in the Fundiario department of Funai and the Educación department of Funai, who work with the Kayapo too, and are the real spark plugs for pushing this project. So, although there has been a lot of corruption and terrible inefficiency and so on, especially at the higher levels of Funai as a bureaucracy, it seems sometimes just hopeless. At other times and at other levels, there are very good people doing effective things to help the Indians. So you can't generalize. I mean, it's not the good Indians versus the bad white men or government people. And there are wonderful, dedicated Brazilians who have formed NGOs, which have done extremely valuable, just invaluable work to support indigenous causes, and I've tried to work with them. So it just, if you try to be sensitive to who the players in this struggle are, and also even some of the private sector people, businessmen and so on, ranchers, there can be good guys on that side who try to get along in a decent, fair-minded way, as well as murderous bastards in that sector. So you just have to really keep an open mind and find out what's actually happening, and then try to, where you can make a contribution, make it.
The return of ethnographic and anthropological data to the communities with whom one works. One of the things that I've understood, particularly in the Himalayas and in South and Central Asia, about activist anthropology is that there's a commitment to sharing the findings, the data, the analysis with the communities with whom one works. If you talk in Marxian terms of exploitation on the basis of gender, on the basis of age perhaps, access to resources, reproduction, those could be words, concepts that when translated into Kayapo or into Portuguese make people uncomfortable. How does one score, how do you square the circle of being both an activist at the same time talking about things which the indigenous communities themselves may have trouble with reconciling?
Um, well, you don't
It may not be a
have
very
to.
clear question.
Yes, if the question is, how do you deal with, um, on the one hand, as an anthropologist, producing certain sorts of interpretations which are different or alien to, or at least not part of the indigenous worldview or whatever. And on the other hand, being an activist and trying to protect, like, their right to, or help them to reproduce their own cultures or protect their right to be themselves and so on. I guess I don't really think that there's any problem at all. I
Okay.
think that
Have you never been asked then by a Kayapol friend or colleague, hey, I thought you were the guy who was fighting for us. How come you're using the words exploitation in your articles about us? If not, then
no,
great.
there aren't any Kayapo who have got to that level of theoretical
Well, that was my next question.
sophistication. I mean, the Kayapo, for example, have started to have democratic associations in their communities. They've realized that Brazilians and NGOs think that communities, to be proper communities, should have associations with a slate of officers, and there should be voting for these officers, and that periodically there should be a new election, and so on. And several communities have produced such associations with Kayapo names, and then there's an election, and so on. In one of the first instances of this, I said, well, who's going to vote in this election? He says, well, we'll call all the men together. They'll be in the men's house, and everybody can vote. And I said, well, what about the women? He said, well, what about them? Well, why are you going to have them vote too? Does women vote? Never thought about that. He says, well, why don't you let them vote? I mean, why shouldn't they also vote? They're members of the community. They have different kinds of, like, economic involvements with the surrounding society and produce things. They say, and the guy said, oh yeah, okay, so the women can vote too. Things are still at a level where decisions of that sort aren't treated as involving fundamental aspects of Kayapo society and so on. They're still playing a game that's really, it's an alien game. And in many respects, when you can say, listen, well, for example, another time, I was trying to do a bilingual education project where I was teaching fundamental concepts of reading, writing, so on. I tried to use sample words and sentences which were actually political ideas, like, we have a right to our land, this is our culture, blah, blah. Culture is the way we produce ourselves, so on.
Rather than this is a pen, my name is
That's right.
Terrence.
That's right. And so we went along on that basis, but I insisted that girls should be included as well as boys in this. And so they were. And that was a new idea for them, because the previous classes that there had been, at least the earlier ones, missionary taught classes, and the missionaries there were trying to teach them to read their own language so that they could then read a translation of the Bible into their own language by the missionaries. So I taught this class with girls. There is now a series of, well, there are two parallel programs for training Kayapo professores, teachers. One taught by Funai, and another taught by a different sort of NGO-based project. And they teach both girls and boys. And there are a lot of literate now, Kayapo girls and boys, literate in both Kayapo and Portuguese. And, I think, at least agitating with the Kayapo for both boys and girls education has been part of that situation. I think it would have happened if I had never been there, but I think the fact that I was there and had gone through those things with them probably helped in some instances to promote that. I could go on with examples like that, but I think it's at that level that one can start to make a difference with things like that, rather than, one can preach, about one man, one vote, or one person, one vote, or something, and that you realize how profoundly that is at variance with a culture where the idea of a person is of a cumulative process of becoming perfect, becoming whole, becoming wise and deserving of political influence, so that the idea that everyone should be equal is transparently absurd. Yeah, you're saying that the oldest man or woman who has lived for whatever 70 years or 50, 60, 70 years, at the height of their powers, activity, they've got experience, they've proved themselves by various things they've done, should be treated for purposes of voting as the same as a newly initiated bachelor youth or a girl who's, 17 or 18 years old? Come on, you can't be serious. That's the Kayapo attitude to things like that. And there's such a gulf between many of the assumptions that we think liberal, progressive NGOs tend to think are the goal of their work, to make the Kayapo more civilized and so on, are profoundly, just profoundly absurd from the Kayapo point of view. You have to be able to understand that and deal with it somehow.
You mentioned, Terry, a move to Chicago at a certain point from Cornell, and now here we are back in Ithaca, Cornell University, from which you recently retired. How long was your Chicago sojourn? What took you there, and what were the general experiences and tenets of that experience in Chicago?
Well, how to say this? I didn't like Ithaca much when my first time here. It was in, as I say, 66 to 68. I had just gotten divorced. I was a young single man, and Ithaca was not at all the cosmopolitan, fascinating, culturally diverse, exciting place that it has since become. It seemed to me to be an extremely provincial, conservative, dull place with terrible weather and very little social action. I mean, if one believes that, as a professor, as I do, one should not get involved in, what shall we say, intimate social relations with students, that leaves very few options, or left very few options in a place like Ithaca. And I found that I was spending my entire salary on weekends in New York and Boston and places where life seemed more possible in ways that were important to me at that time. Uh, well, now that I'm an old fart with a family, it seems very different. I mean, this was, first of all, Ithaca has changed a great deal. I've changed a great deal. Um, what happened was, of course, I gave a speech, talk at one of the Anthro meetings. People from Chicago were in the audience. They invited me to Chicago to give another talk. They decided to offer me a job, and I actually went like a shot. I mean, I thought, I want to be in a city. I want to be in a great university with a theoretically more lively department that's really involved in theoretical issues. See, the department here had seemed to me to be much more, at that time, much more into a kind of area studies emphasis, where the thing was to be a kind of, in effect, an Orientalist scholar, whatever your field was, Oriental or not, and there was no real interest in generalizing theoretical issues. It's not fair to certain people who were here, but the preponderant sort of intellectual life of the department was along those lines. And Chicago was the premier department in the country, really, from a social anthropological point of view, and it was the department in the country that was most identified with taking seriously the tradition of social theory and things like the année sociologique and British social anthropology, with which I'd been most involved as a student and researcher. So I went there and stayed there for 30 years, I guess. I finally left. I went in fall '68 and left in spring 90. What was it? 99. So it's 31.
31 years of professional career.
And meanwhile, I'd gotten married to Jane Fages, who was professor at Cornell. She got a job at Cornell. At the time she was on the job market, I said, look, anywhere in the world you want to go, I'll follow you. I'll arrange a commute or maybe try to get a job there, whatever. Anywhere but Ithaca. I just had fairly dismal memories of Ithaca.
She was a student here, or a professor here, or
she had gotten her degree from Stanford, and then she was an associate in the department in Chicago, along with me. She had done her field work in New Britain, Papua New Guinea, and all that's well known. And she landed a job, of course, at Cornell in Ithaca, and then we had to decide who was going to commute. People here.
What year did she get?
It was August of '89, I guess, that she got the job. In other words, fall '89, and we had 2 young children, young daughters, quite young, 5 and 7, something like that. And so we decided that since she was starting out, didn't have tenure, and was going to have to teach new courses and so on, and then there were the young children who we thought it was more important for them to live with their mother than with me. We decided that I should be the one to commute, and she should, live with the children at her place of work. And that's the way we set it up. Of course, I thought at this time that I was making the sacrifice. I was going to do commuting. I don't like commuting. It's not a good way to live. But of course, at the same time, it made her a single mother for 4 days of every week, or we found we couldn't afford to have commute every weekend from Chicago, so it was every other weekend. But still, well, it was probably more of a strain on Jane than it was certainly than on me. But nevertheless, she published her book and got tenure and so on. And
was Jane with you in Chicago until '89
yeah.
when she got the job at Cornell?
Yeah.
So how did you do it? You flew U.S. Air from Chicago through Philadelphia or Pittsburgh to Ithaca once or twice every couple of weeks?
You got it.
Amazing. And you maintained an apartment in Chicago or a house?
Well, we had lived in a collective house in Chicago with political friends. It had been founded in the palmy days of collectives and radical politics. 1968, the guy who became the Secretary of, first I guess, was it Treasury, but then of State, George Shultz, Nixon's Secretary of State, had lived in a townhouse 5 minutes walk from the university campus, south side of Chicago. And when he went to Washington, it was offered for sale, and a graduate student in the Anthropology department, who came from a quite wealthy family, had enough capital to team up with a bunch of other graduate students, and they made an offer on the house, and they bought the house. They painted the door red. It became known, it was no longer George Shultz's residence, it was the Red Cats Collective. And we moved in after, I don't know, 3 years or so. And that became the place where we lived, and we had both our children in Chicago when we were living there. Well, then, of course, Jane got the job, and she and the kids moved here. But I continued then to live in a room in that collective when I was in Chicago. So it was a little bit more than a pied-à-terre. I mean, it was eating with the folks there, and kind of a home away from home, can I say that? Or it was what had been home for both of us. And it still is when I go back. I still have, of course, students in Chicago who are finishing their degrees, and when I go back to sit on their defenses and so on, I stay at the collective.
It must be difficult to sum up 30 years of professional life in a university like Chicago, but for those who are not at Chicago, the university, at least the Anthropology department, carries a certain mystique and allure. It is definitely one of the world's most dynamic and well-known departments for a number of reasons. Does it differ very much from the department here at Cornell, and what are the changes that you've seen in your 30 years of professional association with the Chicago department?
Well, Cornell has changed an enormous amount. I mean, the Cornell department is a lot more like what the Chicago department was. I think the Chicago department has also changed a great deal, because almost all the people who were committed to the kind of social anthropology, great tradition of social theory, have left.
Such as?
Well, I mean, the people who first, Radcliffe Brown taught there, and then Fred Egan was there. It was a Radcliffe Brownian, and then Tom Fallows, the Bavarian, the Clifford Garretts, David Schneider, both of them students, ex-students of Talcott Parsons at Harvard, but people who had spent time, in Schneider's case, in the London School of Economics, and had been closely associated with some figures in British anthropology. and Nur Yalman, Stanley Tambaya, who are both from Cambridge, and Raymond Smith, also from Cambridge. I mean, a whole line of people like that. Now, all those people have either left the university for one reason or another, to take jobs elsewhere, or in a couple of cases died, or retired. And I'd include myself in that sort of line of people, number of people. And now there are, well, there are a number of new people who have been hired in sociocultural anthropology, and they're excellent people. They just don't have. I don't think there's not the same continuity of orientation. So it's not that. I'd say the continuity now is represented by, I'd say, John and Jean Komaroff, from that sort of line of people. But anyhow, here at Cornell, instead of the old, well, when I was here, it was, as I say, really the old system was that the basis of the program was simply aerial preparation and becoming a specialist in one area or the other. And there was no common curriculum. You formed a committee, and the committee could be all sinologists or all whatever, your area. And you just did all your reading, your preparation, your general examinations, or A exams, they call them here. And then there was, you'd write your thesis with those people and so on. So there was no, the department had no commitment that there should be any common body of theoretical reading or history of anthropology preparation. Not that there weren't people who taught courses in theory or history of anthropology, but they weren't in any sense required or expected of graduate students in the program. So there were some who would take the courses, but others wouldn't. And so it had no kind of identity, collective identity, any commitment to a common vision of anthropology in any sense, except as a set of area expertises. That changed partly around the time that Jane came here. She was part of this, but was certainly not the only part. I mean, a number of the other people in the department had felt that it was time that the university should, that the department here should have a common core of coursework where people would be exposed to the ideas of anthropology and ideas of social theory, or a relation between anthropology and say, well, economics, linguistics, so on. But also people should know the history of the field, what American anthropology, how it developed, what about British, French, German, etc. And so there were courses instituted to teach that, and students were let know that even though they weren't going to be forced to take these courses, that the department thought it would be a good idea if they did. And of course there have been some kind of defiant holdouts of people really actively trying to keep their students from taking these common courses, but many others who have taken them, and I think it has given the department a completely different feeling than it once had, and a feeling much more like the Chicago department.
A couple of final, albeit large, questions. The first is that about the Kaipo video project, which I understand was started in 1990. you'd worked with the BBC and Granada Television, making ethnographic films or anthropological documentaries, whatever one might want to call them. Could you explain a little about the history of the Kayapo Video Project, what it aimed to do, what it succeeded in doing, what the challenges were?
Well, as you've mentioned, I made some documentary films, first with the BBC, in a series called Face Values. That was back in the 80s, and then 2 films with Granada, one in 87 and one in 89. And in all those cases, I had come to Kayapo communities with British film crews, and we made, we shot a lot of footage, many hours film, and made films for British television, although they, in several cases, have since been shown in many countries, though interestingly, never in Brazil. The Kayapo had, before the first time I went to the Kayapo, a couple of years before, 3 Brazilians who were students of kind of media and communication studies in Rio had the idea of going to the Kayapo with a video camera and shooting themselves doing the shooting, but then and this was a general documentation of whatever they could find that seemed significant, and then they taught a couple of the Kayapo to use the video camera, and in a couple of cases brought them out to Rio, where they gave them more training, sort of in a couple of cases, well, in one case anyway, rather advanced training in video and film techniques, not editing but shooting, and they left a video camera with them. Now that video camera no longer worked when 3 years later I showed up with the BBC crew, but the Kayapo were already savvy enough about visual representation to know that they could do it, and that there were Kayapo who had learned to do it. Secondly, they had a much better idea than other, perhaps, first-time experiences with video in maybe New Guinea or something like that. A much better idea of the role of visual media, television and cinema, and photography and the press and so on, in the national culture. I mean, how important television news programs and movies and so on were. So that the idea of making films that then might be shown to themselves in this way, on monitors and so on, but also to Brazilians and the world, was an exciting idea for them. And so when I came with these, as I say, the British crews, one of the things we had to consider was what sort of presence to bring to the communities to sort of our reciprocity for them cooperating with us. And I made a point that one part of that reciprocity should be video cameras that one each trip, so that we could provide them with video cameras at the same time that we were filming them. And then, of course, the question was, what would they shoot? And this was an interesting question, from a variety of points of view. Also, how would they shoot it? And what community reaction, what community involvement would be? Would everybody want to be the cameraman? Or would they be indifferent to it? All those sorts of things. Those were the kinds of questions that I started out with. But when I considered that it was not just a question for them of doing interesting a close-up or panoramic shots or whatever. Actually, they weren't interested in close-ups. They were interested in panoramic. But also how they were going to construct, if they had a chance, overall representations of events, like a ceremony. Turned out that, of course, the things that they most wanted to shoot were ceremonies. When I gently suggested that they should also film things like gardening, they looked up like eyes would roll up. Gardening? Why? They weren't interested in the quotidien, everyday life. They were interested in the spectacular, the extraordinary. They were interested in things that they considered to epitomize their values of beauty and finesse and performance, panache, and they really, they really developed, organized their skills around shooting things that embodied those values. But the next step, obviously, well, also, they did certain other things that I thought were interesting and showed a lot of sophistication and intercultural awareness. They realized that the Brazilians, one of the ways the Brazilians classified themselves in relation to them, the indigenous people, was that the Brazilians controlled the technology of representation. So that it was important for them to demonstrate to the Brazilians that they jolly well controlled the same technology of representation, and that while the Brazilians were pointing cameras at them, they were going to walk up to the Brazilian cameras and point the camera right back at the Brazilian camera, and the Brazilian or world documentary, BBC or whatever, cameraman shooting them. And they did this, and then they carried this over to things like filming the Brazilian Constitutional Convention that was writing the clauses, the new clauses of the new Constitution for indigenous rights. And so they show up and film the debate, including members of the opposition who were orating against the idea of indigenous rights and so on. And they would get right up close to those guys and just hold the camera on them as they said, well, indigenous people are incapable of blah, blah, blah.
How involved did you become in this process? I know you've written about it and you've lectured about it, but were you often there at some of these recording events?
Some, but not all. I certainly didn't have to be there. By the time, well, really, after very little time with them, we're teaching some things about video and camera technique and that sort of thing. I didn't have to be there. But one thing I realized it was a need that I really could fulfill, and a place where things would get even more interesting from my point of view, was that what they would do was produce these continuous shoots, and then they would have these cassettes of video, which they would then show to themselves, and they could hook it up to a monitor and VCR, something else that I had been able to provide. And then they would kick around the villages, getting dustier and more stretched and so on, and that would be that. Potentially, anyway, they would get lost and damaged and so on. So they needed an archive, a place where these things could safely be stored, and then copies could be made. But of course, the other thing they needed to be able to do, above all, was to be able to edit their footage, so that they could construct out of their raw rushes, the raw footage, deliberate representations of the essence of these events, whatever they were, as they saw them, either their own ceremonies or encounters with the Brazilians or whatever. So I started to, first of all, I started this video project. I got a grant from the Spencer Foundation to help train Kayapo to edit and produce videos, which could then be used for kind of an oral history and education of the Kayapo, by the Kayapo of other Kayapo. The Center for Indigenous Work, the Centro de Trabalho Indigenista of São Paulo, made available its editing studio. It has a project, or it had a project then, called Video in the Villages, run by Vincent Carelli. And Vincent collaborated with and supported this Kayapo project, and provided technicians at the Centro in São Paulo to work with Kayapo cameramen who came and learned to edit their own videos. Meanwhile, I had assumed the role of assistant editor. So what I had done was keep the shot record. And then I would sit with the Kayapo editors, acting like an assistant editor, with namely, tracking their decisions for cutting and inserts and so on, all the things they would do with their own shots, and noting on the shot record which they used and what their reasons for making the decision if those questions arose. And I realized that this is a way, it's a way, a very material way in which you can study the process of the formation of representations. It's an objective correlative, as T.S. Eliot might put it, of that process, and it was profoundly interesting. I thought it's a field method. My one contribution to, I think, the literature on methodology or field methods: become an assistant film editor of an indigenous cameraman as he edits footage. And if you've done the shot record properly, you have a total inventory of what the raw material of the representation is, and then you can see how he plays over this raw material and shapes it into a finished construction. So that was, as it were, the anthropological side of the Kayapo video project. But the other side was, of course, that the Kayapo produced these marvelous films of their own ceremonies and encounters with the Brazilians, and they're still doing.
And were those films shown on Brazilian television? Or
Never. And not on Brazilian television. They've been shown in various other places. The Brazilians have not been into showing indigenous work, especially indigenous films about their own, about Brazilian officials' encounters with Kayapo, since some of those have been highly agonistic. But I'm not saying they haven't shown other indigenous footage. They've shown some of Vincent Carelli's films. But they've been shown in many festivals around the world, for example, and been shown in somewhat here. The thing that keeps them from being, or has kept them from being more widely shown, is of course that they are produced by Kayapo for other Kayapo, and they're in Kayapo. In 3 cases, I've made translations, either into English or in some in parts of one in Portuguese, but with subtitles and so on. There's English narration and English subtitles. But I have to do a lot more of that. And now that I've retired from teaching, I'm going to work a lot more on those films.
I have then 2 final questions. One about the retirement and the plans now that you've reduced your teaching load. I won't say completely finished, because I'm sure you have grad students who will continue to supervise. And
oh yeah, but I'm not giving courses.
I'm not giving lectures on a daily basis. But the main question is about something that happened in September 2000. And I quote here from an article. In an extraordinary open letter to the American Anthropological Association last week, Terence Turner of Cornell University and Leslie Swansell of the University of Hawaii alerted the association and hundreds of participants on several email lists to the upcoming publication of Darkness in El Dorado, How Scientists and Journalists Devastated the Amazon. This has been a moment in contemporary anthropology which has captivated an audience beyond the anthropological. It went to the New York Times, The Guardian in London. Many students of social science know about this. Could you explain a little bit now, for the record, what happened, what you did, what the responses and reactions were, and in a way, why it was so important?
Well, that passage that you've just read is a great example of something that Glenda Jackson, in one of her roles, where she is, I don't know, the wife of some British colonial official in Africa, says to a journalist about the journalist's misrepresentations of what I guess her husband had been up to or something. She has a little wind-up doll, and she winds it up and puts it on the table in front of the journalist and says, "This is my journalism doll. Wind it up and it gets it wrong." That wasn't an open letter that we wrote. It was never intended to be generally circulated. It was certainly not addressed to any general readership. It was a warning, an advice, let's say, advising the president and one or two other high, I don't know, what do you call them, officials, like the head of the Ethics Committee and the head of the Committee for Human Rights of the association, that this book that we had been sent as press readers was about to be published, and it was dynamite, and it was really going to raise extremely urgent questions of ethics, of professional ethics, that the association was going to be held accountable for, because this was, after all, it involved the work of Napoleon Chagnon, who was the best-selling ever author of anthropology books, and the one that's The Fierce People and its various other editions, has been the basis of many, basis. It's been assigned in many introductory anthropological courses all over the country. And so the profession has a certain involvement with Chagnon's work, and also more distant remove. I mean, there is the whole basis of anthropological, of human genetics, which had been the basis of the anthropological, of the expeditions to the Yanomami, which Chagnon had been part of, but of course James Neal was the leader of those expeditions. And what they had done and how they had represented what they'd done were issues that the book addressed in great detail. And the details were pretty horrific. And it was easy to see that when this book was actually published, it was going to be read by journalists and cause a scandal, a sensation. And as indeed it did. And it was reviewed widely, often very favorably, and it got various kinds of honorable mentions for the National Book Award and all that. It was going to be a big book, and we thought that the leadership of the association should be apprised of this, what was in it, and what the kinds of things, the issues that it raised, so that they should prepare to perhaps investigate it, prepare statements, how to deal with the kind of scandal that this was going to cause.
Well, my first question then is, what were the allegations in the book? And secondly, if you're simply saying to the professional organization which holds together the discipline which you're in, hey, you should know about this book that's coming out, it's rather important, and in fact you should be preparing some kind of press release or some information to deal with this, what was the storm about?
Well, first let me say that what happened when we sent this letter to the president of the association and one or two other people in positions of authority in the association was that one of them, on her or his own hook, hit the button on the computer and just started broadcast it out to the world. That person has never identified her or himself. No doubt because he or she recognizes and realizes that, first of all, it was a breach of trust. It was a personal letter. Anyhow, there were a series of issues in the initial phase of this controversy. One was what Patrick Tierney, the author of the book, had actually said about the conduct of the expedition to the Yanomami in 1968 on the Orinoco, where they became involved in an epidemic of measles that broke out, and they at the same time were interested in drawing blood samples and other biological samples, and they also had a vaccine that they were using to inoculate the Yanomami. They have maintained that this was a purely humanitarian gesture. Others, including Tierney, have suggested that it was an experimental measure. That is, the vaccine was almost certainly selected because it was particularly liable to arouse very strong, severe reactions, indistinguishable from wild measles. And therefore, it was a way of testing the immune systems of these Yanomami who were a, quote, virgin soil population. They never had contact with the disease. It was known that Neil was interested in such issues. And there was no real evidence, hard evidence, in Neil's own protocols for this inoculation campaign. No protocol, it's extraordinary, but no protocol has ever been found prepared by Neil. But it was obvious that Neil and his medical assistant, Dr. Willard Centerwall, were aware of the reactive properties of this vaccine before they went down, because Centerwall wrote a kind of a mini protocol, which he and Neil, well, he was the person who actually wrote it and sent it to some missionaries to whom they sent some of this vaccine. Now, what did happen was that a great many Yanomami, nobody knows how many, died of the measles, and Tierney suggested that these deaths may, at least in part, have been caused by the vaccine. In fact, maybe the whole epidemic might have been caused by the vaccine. Many others have dismissed that, either said that vaccine can't cause actual cases of the disease, or fatal cases of the disease. That, by the way, is simply not true, and vaccines do, from time to time, either because they're bad lots of vaccine or because of reactions, cause deaths or very severe illness. But also, the idea was that whether or not there was going to be any deaths in these vaccines, Neil was interested in the degree to which the Yanomami would turn out to be, on the basis of their just innate genetic makeup, able to resist this vaccine, or resist the effects of, in effect, of contact with measles. Now, I guess this is not really the context to go more deeply into this. What happened about that and about many of the other charges in the book, some of which we mentioned, but not nearly all of which we mentioned in our memo to the association, about Chagnon and his effects on the Yanomami, some of his policies, the effects of some of his representations of them, and so on. These, we thought, and Tierney had also charged, raised various kinds of ethical questions. Were they accurate representations? Were they distorted, deliberately distorted in some cases, to bear out socio-biological ideas about Yanomami society, among which were that the Yanomami were actually a kind of an earlier stage of human evolution, much closer to primate societies, somewhere in between apes and humans, with alpha males who killed more enemies, reproducing themselves more, monopolizing more women, and therefore are contributing disproportionately to the gene pool. And was this a kind of a eugenic argument? Well, it was a eugenic argument. Neil explicitly made it as a eugenic argument in a famous article called On Being Headmen, and also in his autobiography. But supporters of sociobiology, including Wilson and others, leapt to the defense of Neil and Chagnon, denying absolutely that there was nothing to this idea, that Neil had such ideas, eugenic ideas, or that there was any experimental or scientific research purpose to these vaccinations, that was only a humanitarian measure, and so on. When I also repeated my own personal experience with James Neal, who at one point had proposed to work with a Kayapo rather than the Yanomami, and he ended up with one of his Brazilian assistants, did in fact work with a Kayapo with cooperation from me. I provided the genealogies that they used to test degrees of genetic distance and so on in the Kayapo. Where am I? This idea that Neil had eugenic interests and was interested in the effects of the relation of resistance to disease, to genetics and so on, and was using the vaccination campaign to test this in some way, which of course is not incompatible with the idea that was also a humanitarian gesture. And it was a point I continually made in the ensuing debate. It's not enough to say that it was a humanitarian gesture. Of course it was a humanitarian gesture. And Neil said that too. But that in no way says that it wasn't also for scientific purposes.
Sure, a research exercise.
Yeah.
Sure.
At the same time, that point was never taken. Nobody has ever, on that side, the other side, and it was a side that came out with, great numbers of people thunderously denying absolutely that this epidemic thing and the injections and everything had any relation to research purposes. Even when I disclosed, having been alerted to this by Barbara Johnston, who was researching Neil's earlier work in the Pacific Islands, and that Neil had been part of a project in which vaccinations for things like pertussis, whooping cough, and measles and so on, were used to, quote, challenge immune systems so that the levels of reactions could be tested by the reactions to the vaccinations rather than to the diseases. I mean, he'd already been part of this and done this, but the only response to that was that by the main person who was became Neil's main defender on the American Anthropological Association board. This is Trudy Turner. Was that, well, my investigation did not include this memo, so I'm not going to address it. It was a kind of spin and stonewalling. Anyway, as I guess the point I'm getting up to is that a new echelon of issues arose in the course of what became a big controversy with lots of vitriolic emails and so on, much of it personal attacks on Sponsor myself, which was that the association itself and the profession and those who were conducting this debate, many of them not anthropologists but sociobiologists or evolutionary psychologists, as they now call themselves, that their conduct of this debate was about as ethical and as devoted to scientific truth and critical exchange as Karl Rove's descriptions of, or the people who are working with him, descriptions of John Kerry's conduct and combat in Vietnam. And the association, which then proceeded to appoint a task force, which consisted of people who were about, in some cases as neutral and in other cases as pro-Chagnon as could be found, Chagnon and pro-Neil, as it turned out, and produced, in several cases, obviously tendentious and biased accounts. The association acted primarily in a way calculated to cover up and just deflect the material rather than going into it. Although after the preliminary version of the report was released at an anthropology meeting and aroused a storm of controversy and protest, the Society of Latin American Anthropologists called unanimously in its business meeting for the withdrawal of this report, and there was great criticism in the business meeting itself of the association of it. That seemed to give some courage to the report, to some of the people on the commission, and in fact, the report, as it finally came out of the commission, makes several very important points, and I think that's one of the lasting legacies of the controversy. But legacy number one, the main charges that Tierney raised were never actually, have not been refuted. They haven't, in some cases, the things about the vaccine, how much medical damage it actually caused, or the way it was administered, how much that damage that caused, has never really been resolved. But many other criticisms of Chagnon, for example, the damage he's done by both his statements and silences about the Yanomami, and the ways in which some of his actions actually damaged the Yanomami. For example, the whole business in the Siapa Valley that he attempted to carry out with, in conjunction with a right-wing Venezuelan politician called Brewer Carillas. These things were certainly attested and denounced by the task force, called evidences of breach of professional ethics. Some of Tierney's charges were indeed borne out by the commission. Secondly, the thing that was originally said that by the officers of the association, the presidents of the association, that the association could not investigate. It could only study and advise, but not investigate, certainly not individuals, and that this task force was not an investigation. Well, it turned out that it had to be an investigation, and the issues of Chagnon's conduct especially, and also Neil's, could not be investigated or studied apart from the individuals who had committed them. And so the ad hoc committee of the beneficial body of the association actually ended up investigating and finding critical fault with the actions of individual anthropologists, something that was denied at the beginning. And this is a historic accomplishment. Another historic accomplishment is the Code of Ethics of the Association was said to be not a document which could be used to evaluate the conduct of individuals, but only an educative, advisory sort of set of general principles. Well, in fact, it turned out that those principles, to the extent they meant anything, actually had to be applied. Their applicability to the actions of individuals had to be considered, and in certain cases it was found that the individuals had violated